I'm Lawrence Patias, and this part of the lecture is going to be on cognitive appraisal theories and extensions from those theories. So basically we're going to be talking about well-supported theories of emotion today. Now, Magda Arnold was an interesting pioneering female psychologist who was born in 1903 in what was then Austria, now it's the Czech Republic. And she later emigrated to Canada and then the USA, and she passed away at the age of 99 in 2002. In Magda Arnold's early work, she expressed doubts about both the James Lange theory of emotion and the Cannon-Bard theory, finding inconsistencies. At that time, in her 1945 paper here, she did not seem to mention the role of cognition or thoughts at that time, but she had doubts that she developed later. But by 1960, in her book Emotion and Personality, she introduced what has been called the first cognitive appraisal theory of emotion. My reading of some of her work is that she retained some of the physiological and instinct explanations of emotion from the previous two theories, James Lange and Cannon-Bard, but said that they were lacking because they did not have a cognitive appraisal explanation, and that's what she introduced. She developed her cognitive theory in the late 50s and 1960s, saying that the first step in emotion is an appraisal of the situation, and the initial appraisals start the emotional sequence and arousal, both the appropriate actions and the emotional experience of itself, so that the physiological changes recognized as important accompany but do not initiate the actions and experiences. Arnold also introduced an idea of intuitive appraisal, in which she describes emotions that lead to an action. For example, if you succeed after trying hard in an endeavor, the felt emotion of happiness will motivate the person to keep working hard in the future. So in her model, there are appraisals, emotions, and resulting motivation that drives action. Now, Arnold's theory of cognitive appraisals led to Richard Lazarus to develop theories of cognitive appraisal too, and others. And in the process of that development, an argument was developed between Zions here and Lazarus on what came first. Zions argued that affect can sometimes come first before any cognitive appraisal, and Lazarus, on the next slide, argued that cognition almost always precedes affect and causes affect. So Zions argued that emotions do sometimes come before cognition. He conceded that sometimes cognition comes first. And Zions also argued that emotion and cognition are different systems, the emotion system being the limbic system and cognition being the cortex. Let me take a quote from Zions's paper here. He writes that a direct pathway from the retina to the hypothalamus has been demonstrated in a large number of species. So Zions argued that stimuli can go straight from the eye to the emotional center of the brain, trigger the emotion. For example, fear, once the bear is seen, goes straight from the retina to the hypothalamus. And the emotion may start even before cognitive appraisals kick in. So sometimes he says that emotion or affect can come first. Now, Lazarus would counter this by saying that the identification of the bear in your environment involves cognitive processing and appraisal, however basic that cognition may be in quick reactions to fear, before the system registers it as a threat. So Lazarus says that even in that situation, cognition comes first. Now, Lazarus's response to Zions's article in American Psychologist was published in 1984, And he argued that cognitions came before emotion in almost all cases, and that cognitions and emotions are more intertwined rather than being separate systems. Now let me take a quote from Lazarus to give you an idea of what he was arguing. So he says that cognitive activity is a necessary precondition of emotion because to experience an emotion, people must comprehend, whether it be in the form of a primitive evaluative perception or a highly differentiated symbolic process. So he is categorizing even simple primitive perceptions, such as a bear being present, as a cognitive appraisal, as well as the more complicated cognitive appraisals that perhaps Zions was thinking about. So here you see the crux of the argument between Lazarus and Zions. Lazarus is saying that even perceptions are cognitive appraisals, and Zions is saying perceptions are too basic to be called a cognitive appraisal. Now, I tend to agree with Lazarus, but I'm always open to suggestions or evidence that might be on Zions's side. And I think the only thing I might disagree with Lazarus on is his focus on cognitive appraisals being the only cause or the primary cause of emotions. In retrospect, I think biology and neurotransmitters in the brain and physiology are perhaps lesser causes of emotion, but causes nevertheless. Which brings us to one of your readings for this week, Lazarus's 1991 paper on his cognitive appraisal theory. Now, this is quite late in Lazarus's career. He had written about appraisal theory decades before, but this is a culmination of his defense of his appraisal theory. Now, there are many parts to the article that you can read in your own time about the relation between cognition, emotion, motivation, and the importance of that in development as well. But in this lecture, I just want to pull out one quote and talk about that to examine what Lazarus thinks about cognition and emotion. Specifically, whether he's clinging to the idea that cognition or cognitive appraisals are the only cause of emotion. So in this quote, he says, in one prominent theory of the effects of cocaine, microbiologists have proposed that the drug produces euphoria by flooding the synapses with chemicals such as dopamine and epinephrine. Lazarus goes on to say, however, the question remains whether the effect on mood is direct or mediated by the way these chemicals influence the appraisal process. For example, cocaine is said to facilitate neural functioning as a result of an increased rate of neurotransmission, and therefore to result in enhanced energy, self-confidence, personal power, and sense of security. No wonder the person feels euphoric and on top of the world for a little while, given the temporarily enhanced and subjective perceived functional power. This, of course, is a totally subjective and phony high because nothing basic has really changed in the person's environmental relationship. And after a short time, when the neurotransmitters are back to normal or at subnormal levels, the person crashes and becomes dysphoric. Now, this is from his paper here on page 356. So what Lazarus is saying here is that even when it appears that something physical or biological like cocaine is causing an emotion like euphoria, he is saying that the mediating cause is appraisal. So in other words, he's saying that cocaine affects our appraisals of the world, and because our appraisals of the world change, then our emotion changes. Another way to interpret this information is not to cling to cognitive appraisals as being the only cause of emotion, and just to acknowledge that yes, the physical body does also affect emotions in a multi-causal system where cognitive appraisals are one of the main causes of emotion. So Lazarus's theory is one that I subscribe to, apart from the fact that maybe, like many psychologists in the past, he was clinging to a monocausal theory of the world, where psychology has actually moved on from that, and we look at systems as being multi-causal in the present paradigm. Now, there are a number of other appraisal theories that do explain different aspects of emotions, such as Fontaine-Scherer et al.'s theory of appraisal, theory of emotion, in which they question whether there are only two dimensions of emotion. So in past research in emotion, researchers have focused on just two dimensions. That's valence, whether it's negative or positive, and the arousal level of the emotion. But they argue that those are not sufficient dimensions. Now they suggest four different dimensions to explain the whole breadth of emotions. So one is the evaluation pleasantness dimension, where an evaluation is made in the appraisal of how pleasant or unpleasant a stimulus or the environment is. The second dimension is potency control. The third dimension is activation arousal. And the fourth dimension is predictability. And the evaluation and appraisal of all four of these dimensions fit together to then produce a specific emotion. For example, if you have the pleasantness dimension as being very unpleasant, if you have the potency control dimension as being within your control, and the activation arousal is high, and the predictability is also high, that might produce the emotion anger, or high arousal anger specifically. Or you might call that rage. On the other hand, if you tweak the activation arousal dimension to be low and keep all the other dimensions the same, then you might have frustration rather than rage. So this is a complicated theory, which is necessary to explain the dozens of different nuances of different types of emotion. We have 5 basic emotions, of course, but there are many dozens more of nuanced emotions, such as frustration, rage, slight sadness, extreme sadness, and so on. And Fridget and Parrott made an attempt to explain emotions from appraisals using a different model. Now, they came up with the idea of identifying what they call emotions. Is a German word that means basic or fundamental. And they said that these foundations are underlying nodes of action readiness. And they came up with 16 different emotions that they say are universal. For example, just a few of them are accepting the presence of a stimuli, domination, caring, all of these basic elements. And their claim was that these form the basic elements of emotion, and when you put them together, you get specific emotions coming out of them. So I wanted to alert you to the fact that there are several different appraisal theories. They're quite difficult to test and contrast with one another to see which one is correct. But nevertheless, they're interesting, even if the field does look a little messy at this time, given that there's more than one appraisal theory out there, that each one of them is fairly complicated. Now, moving on from pure appraisal theories of emotion to more recent work, on emotions that kind of branch off from appraisal theory are still in the scientific branch of psychology. And I should say nowadays there are quite a lot of research articles that are scientific and on emotion that give reliable information about emotion. And those articles are more likely to be found in journals like Psychological Science or the journal Emotion. And the less scientific theories of emotion are more likely to be found online or in popular books. But be aware, there's hundreds of articles on emotion that that constitute very good science. Now, two of those articles we're going to look at this week are by Wilson and Gilbert. They have done work on affective forecasting, which is the idea that how do we forecast how we are going to feel in the future after a significant event happens. And another idea of theirs, which is well researched, is affective adaptation, how our affect or emotions adapt to stimuli and change over time as we explain that stimuli. So this is one of your assigned readings, and what I've tried to do this week in the assigned readings is to focus on giving you articles that are fairly reliable, and this is no exception. So in this article on affective forecasting, first of all, affective forecasting is guessing how we will feel in the future. All right, so like a weather forecast, how we will feel in the future. And what they found in this research is that we tend to overestimate the intensity and duration of the emotion to future events. For example, we think that winning the lottery will bring positive emotions more intensely than they actually do, and that the positive emotions will last longer than they actually do. On the other side of the coin, we also think that if we acquire a disability or if there's a big loss in our lives, it will lead to negative emotions that are more intense than they actually are, and that those negative emotions would last longer than they actually do. And you can see how these biases in affective forecasting might actually help us stay motivated, right? So, for example, if we think that we're going to be very happy when we receive our degree, and we're going to be permanently happy and intensely happy for a long period, then that keeps us very motivated to achieve those goals. Similarly, if we think we're going to be devastated by losses in our life, that keeps us motivated to avoid those losses. So these biases are good for motivation, but there is some benefit to knowing about these biases so that we do not expect to be permanently happy when something happens, like gaining a degree or getting married, and to understand more that those positive things in our lives don't permanently alter emotion, but they are still constructive. Similarly, knowing these biases might give us some comfort if we do experience a great loss in our lives. If we know that our emotions are going to return to a baseline sooner rather than later, because we know about these biases in affective forecasting, that might be great comfort to people to know as those losses occur. And you can imagine how knowing about these biases might be helpful when you're working with a client in a therapeutic situation. There might be some circumstances where it occurs that the client would benefit from knowing about these biases. For example, if they're going through a great loss, you can tell them about how we tend to overestimate how negative and how long the emotions will last. Similarly, if you have a client coming across great success, it might benefit them to know that their euphoria will not last very long, but that nevertheless the success is very important. And your final reading for this week is the affective adaptation paper by Wilson and Gilbert. So the theory goes like this. The first time a stimulus is presented, we have a strong emotional reaction. If we explain this, sometimes we would not explain this, but let's assume that if we explain to ourselves why we had that reaction, we explain the environment to ourselves. The second time we get that same stimuli, we have a less strong emotional reaction due to explaining away. Now, the model that they discuss in the article is that we first attend to a stimulus, then we react to a stimulus, and there's an emotional reaction in there, and then we explain our emotions in the context of the environment that produced the emotion, and then we adapt. And the adaptation is that we become less intensely emotional towards that stimulus. Now, this has parallels to behavioral theory, where habituation in behavioral theory, but it's different in the sense that the causal mechanism here is the explanation. And in fact, when you do not explain your emotions, do not integrate them with understanding the environment that produced those emotions, then they find that the reduction in emotional reaction does not go down as much as it would do if you explained it. So this demonstrates the therapeutic value of explaining emotions, understanding the context at which those emotions arise, which happens in some therapies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy and other therapies. And this might explain why talk therapy is helpful in some cases. So if the goal in therapy is to reduce extreme emotion reactions to a stimuli, then one way to do this is exposure therapy. You've heard of that before, but also, according to this theory, is to explain the environment and how the emotion arose from the environment, and that should reduce the emotional reaction in the future. Now, the questions I want you to think about are there any benefits in clients knowing about affective adaptation in the therapy clinic? Now, how would you answer that? Well, I can think of one example. Let's say that you have a client come in very emotional because of something that happened in their life, and if you do become a therapist, you will encounter situations like this. My question is, would it be comforting for the client to know the theory of emotion, well-supported theory of emotion, that if they integrate and explain the situation, that the terrible emotional reactions, negative emotional reactions that they're having now will be less in the future? Perhaps that would be comforting to a client. Not only is it comforting to the client, but it also happens to be true as well. So let's discuss what we've talked about in these series of 2 lectures this week. I hope it has been valuable information for you, as much as it was valuable information for me when I first heard about the debunking of catharsis theory, and I started to replace that theory in my own mind with appraisal theories and other good recent theories of emotion. It's benefited me personally to understand emotion better than I did when I believed in catharsis theory. But in a broader sense, the development of modern theories of emotion, such as Lazarus's appraisal theory and modern theories from Gilbert and Wilson, have helped. I've seen the parallels in improvements in psychotherapy too. So the cognitive behavioral therapies, cognitive therapies, and related therapies have had very good efficacy in treating a wide variety of psychopathologies without any need for the kind of strong social influence that was involved in earlier therapies, and in therapies that use catharsis theory or repressed memories and so on. So as a whole, I feel that appraisal theories have improved psychotherapies to become much more saner and less damaging without using strong social pressure to extract miracle anecdotes. So what we went over in the series of lectures is, first we talked about influential early theories, such as Darwin's theory that emotions have evolved from early animals' movements, facial movements and bodily movements that had adaptive function when they evolved, and then they were adapted to be part of emotions by humans and primates. Darwin's theory was a good theory, but of course there was one aspect of the theory that could be problematic. If you remember, he said that there's a type of buildup of nervous energy that can be discharged as emotion. It's kind of a precedent of catharsis theory, and indeed Freud was affected or influenced by Darwin's idea. Another influential early theory, if you remember, is the James Lange theory, the idea that we see a stimulus, we have a physiological response in the body, and our interpretation of our bodily state is the emotion. And then the Cannon-Bard theory came along and said, hang on a minute, if James Lange theory is correct, we should have distinct physiological bodily reactions for every different emotion. And in fact, we don't. Some physiological reactions are common to more than one emotion. And with their experimentation with cats, Cannon and Bard came to propose a theory that the thalamus sends out signals and is the cause or the center of emotion. This was adapted later by Paul MacLean, who stated that it's not just the thalamus at the center of the emotion, but it's the limbic system. Now, these ideas are a little bit out of date now, but there you have it. We also talked about one of the early experimental demonstrations by Schachter and Singer that cognition is very important in the formation of emotions. And the Schachter and Singer experiment, of course, is when they injected epinephrine, and some people interpreted the epinephrine as being euphoria. Some people interpreted it as being anger, depending on the social situation and depending on their assessment of why they were excited, their cognitive appraisal of why they were aroused. And then we start to discuss catharsis theory that we've talked about already. The catharsis theory is the idea that emotions are a substance, they build up inside, and they need to be released, otherwise they might do damage. Also known as a hydraulic theory of emotion. Now, we noted already that there's problems with this in that the therapies were not very effective that use this theory, that research articles have debunked the idea of the catharsis, such as the Brad Bushman paper, of course. But in addition to that, since Freud and Breuer suggested this theory, there's been 100 years of physiological research that has shown that there's no part of the brain or nervous system that stores something like emotion, right? So there's been no discoveries, and this is somewhat of a null finding, but still it doesn't support catharsis. There's been no discovery in the brain of a section of the brain that stores a substance such as emotion. And then once we had debunked catharsis theory, we to replace that theory, we suggested more supported ideas of how emotion works, such as appraisal theory, just the basic idea that our evaluation of the environment and agents in that environment, and the intention of those agents, our immediate evaluation of that produces emotions. And as the environment changes, our emotions change. And Magda Arnold was a pioneer in the theorizing about appraisal theory. Richard Lazarus carried on the development of appraisal theory, and you have other theories being put forward by Frege and Fontaine and Shearer. And of course you have the famous disagreement between Zions and Lazarus, where Zions said that affect comes first before cognition, and where Lazarus argued that no, there always must logically be a cognition before you can have an emotion. And then I went on to talk about affective forecasting and how humans are not very good at predicting how we will feel in the future. So for example, when something very good happens, we overestimate how long that good feeling or good emotion will last after that, and we overestimate how negative we will feel too when a bad loss happens in our lives. So these are all well-supported theories of emotion. And another theory from Gilbert and Wilson too is the idea of affective adaptation. The idea that explaining the emotion in the context of the environment that it came out of is an important part of reducing emotional reactions in the future.